Good evening. My name is Gillian Eshman, and this is my presentation, The Public and Private Feminine, a feminist critique of international human rights construction. The key points that I would like to talk about tonight is 1. The modern international human rights is based on classical and enlightened period philosophy, which were developed in highly patriarchal societies. 2. The separation of the private and public spheres of rights during the Enlightened period had a negative impact on the development of women's human rights. And thirdly, cultural relativism continues to be an issue affecting the wider acceptance of women's human rights. Ancient philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle argued for the principles of natural law, which base human rights on a natural moral order that is independent of human laws or cultural traditions. Each of the philosophers above were born into and grew up within a patriarchal civilization. This influenced their views on the roles and the rights of women. In Poetics 3, Aristotle positioned that women may be said to be an inferior man. Plato acknowledged that extending civil and political rights to women would substantively alter the nature of the household and the state. There was a recognition in this that the family unit was a smaller microcosm of the relationships and roles that existed in government. Aristotle, who had been taught by Plato, denied that women were slaves or subject to property, arguing that nature has distinguished between the female and the slave, but he considered wives still to be bought. He argued that the women's main economic activity is that of safeguarding the household property created by men. In this, Aristotle is saying that women have a role of raising and looking after the family home, but do not have the necessary skills or aptitude to take part in government, and this would have had a profound impact on the understanding of the needs and rights of women. Thomas Aquinas interpreted the principles of natural law as being the ordinances of reason, that they are for the common good, that the laws are enforceable, and they must be known to people. As women were not considered citizens of Athens during the time of the classical period, they were given no place in the government and would have had no influence upon any of the laws that were made. I personally like Cicero's idea towards natural law, which is the safety of citizens, the preservation of life, and the tranquility and happiness of human life. And Cicero made no differentiate between the genders for these natural laws. Philosophers during the Enlightened period largely focused on the distinction between public and private rights and the distinction between government and home. The acceptance of the separation of these two spheres has major consequences on the formation of human rights for women, as historically the patriarchal society relegated women to the private domain of the home. Within the public sphere, John Locke argued to deny the legitimacy of the right of kings to rule without the consent of the citizens. John Locke failed to recognise the same dichotomy existing within the private sphere of the home. Wives are considered to look to their father or husband as the leaders of the home unit. While the philosophers of the Enlightened period defended democratic principles of equality and challenged the idea that a privileged few should rule over the vast majority of the population, they also argued that these democratic principles should maintain the societal status quo in regards to gender and cultural structures. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that it was the order of nature for woman to obey man. He wrote, "Women do wrong to complain of the inequality of man-made laws," and claimed that when she tries to upspur our rights, she is our inferior. It must be noted that Christian religions had a strong influence on many of the civilizations of this time, and that this would have reinforced the existing patriarchal society. The separation of the public and private sphere remains an ongoing issue for the rights of women in the Western world, as domestic violence continues to be perpetrated against women and children. Types of domestic violence, such as the denial of the right to vote, travel, work, drive, own property, or have personal funds, would never be tolerated within the public sphere if it was, for example, the government who withheld these rights from people based on either racial or religious bias. Many organisations that advocate for human rights have been hesitant to intrude on the private sphere of the home to focus on the plight of women and the abuse of their human rights. Some organisations, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have been slow to begin researching and reporting on domestic violence as a human rights issue, but both organisations have now made committees on these topics. Governments currently have a large amount of interaction on the private sphere through both legal and financial requirements. In Australia, we're still seeing a reluctance to address human rights in both the public and private sphere, as seen in the debate around the amendments to the Racial Discrimination Act. Many commentators have questioned in why the government is happy to be involved in the home sphere through issues such as taxation, laws that surround the requirements for marriage or partnership, issues like inheritance and other family law, but are yet unwilling to play an enforcement role on issues around domestic violence. We must weigh up the rights and the responsibilities of individuals and look at how it would be best to put forward appropriate enforcement. Our concepts of international human rights are built on the liberal traditions of Western culture. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first adopted by the United Nations in 1949, the General Assembly membership represented mainly developed countries. In recent years, however, the dominant culture has become increasingly multicultural. As a result of this greater diversity of beliefs, some interesting challenges to the liberal traditions have arisen. An example of a challenge is female genital mutilation. The social and cultural rights of the community is in conflict with the human rights of the individual. Female genital mutilation pits the cultural norm against the best interests of the woman or girl. This begs the question, can international human rights exist in a culturally diverse world? As the modern world continues to shrink, how can cultural diversity and integrity be respected? And could a global culture emerge based on and guided by human dignity and tolerance? Cultural relativism is the assertion that human values, far from being universal, vary a great deal according to the different cultural perspectives. Some would apply this relativism to the promotion, protection, interpretation, and application of human rights, which could be interpreted differently within different cultures, ethnic and religious traditions. In other words, according to this view, human rights are culturally relative rather than universal. And this is at odds with the natural law element that a law binds one to act. So if we believe that the cultural right is, if we believe that the cultural right is in fact against the human rights of the individual, how is the best way for us to receive acceptance on this matter and also enforce the rights of the individual? The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, was adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly and is often described as an international Bill of Rights for women. The Convention defines discrimination against women as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economical, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. When accepting the Convention, states committed themselves to undertake a series of measures to end discrimination against women in all forms, including to incorporate the principle of equality of men and women in the legal system, abolish all discriminatory laws, and adopt appropriate ones prohibiting discrimination against women, to establish tribunals and other public institutions to ensure that the effective protection of women against discrimination, and to ensure elimination of all acts of discrimination against women by persons, organisations, or enterprises. The Convention is the only human rights treaty which affirms the reproductive rights of women and targets culture and tradition as influential forces shaping gender roles and family relations. It affirms women's right to acquire, change, or retain their nationality and the nationality of their children. Countries that have ratified or acceded to the Convention are legally bound to put the provisions in place. And they are also committed to submit national reports or measures they have taken to comply with their treaty obligations. In her paper, Cosmopolitan Feminism and Human Rights, Niamh Riley promotes the concept of cosmopolitan feminism as a way to reject Western-centric, falsely universalised, and undemocratic imposition of narrowly defined understanding of human rights. I've put a list here of the 5 key elements of cosmopolitan feminism. So, number 1 is a critical engagement with public international law. And we need to promote awareness of the rights of women in the home and then also get a consistent enforcement approach. A global feminist consciousness that challenges the systematic interplay of patriarchal, capitalist, and racist power relations. There needs to be an acknowledgement that the system that has been built was built by men for men, and that the male perspective is by far the dominant perspective. Recognition of intersectionality and a commitment to cross-boundary dialogue, networking, and social criticisms. A number of the issues that are raised within human rights are across gender, race, and disability boundaries. Cosmopolitan feminism actively promotes working together with other areas to ensure that there is a concerted effort to address the dominant perspective and to make sure that a more inclusive approach is considered. And the 4th of the 5 is the development of collaborative advocacy strategies around concrete issues. This is very similar to number 3 and has the same idea of working together across gender, race, and disability boundaries, and to work together to advocate for a more inclusive perspective. And number 5, the utilisation of global forums as sites of cosmopolitan solidarity and citizenship. And this is one of the things we did see with CEDWA, is women getting together to discuss and to inform each other on the different movements around. Because as the natural law said, one of the main rules was around the people must know the law. So by getting women together and discussing what is known, we're able to bring together and have a more informative discussion and build awareness.